Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
All right, so this time we're exploring some ideas from Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Johnson.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his take on tech wealth and fairness is really fascinating stuff.
Hmm.
Especially, this idea that just because we have amazing tech doesn't mean everyone benefits.
Yeah, that's a really common assumption.
For sure. So let's break down Johnson's argument a little.
Okay.
One thing that really stood out to me was this distinction between average and marginal productivity.
Right.
To be honest, those terms sound kind of intimidating at first.
Yeah, they do sound a little technical, but they're not that complicated once you get the hang of it.
Okay, good.
So think about it like this.
Okay.
You know those self-checkout kiosks you see in grocery stores everywhere these days?
Oh, yeah, I use those all the time.
Exactly. Now, for the store itself, those kiosks definitely increase average productivity. They're selling the same amount of groceries, but with fewer employees.
Right.
But what about the workers who are still there? Their wages don't automatically go up just because the store is more efficient overall, you see?
I think so.
It's like their marginal productivity, the value they add by actually being there, hasn't really changed.
So basically, we could end up in a situation where the businesses are becoming more productive thanks to technology, but the workers aren't actually seeing those benefits trickle down to them.
Exactly. That's a key point Johnson is making.
That's pretty concerning. And then he makes this even more provocative comparison.
Oh.
He actually compares digital advertising to cigarettes and junk food.
Whoa. That's a pretty bold statement.
Right. It sounds pretty extreme at first.
It does. But Johnson argues that digital advertising, just like those things, can actually be harmful. He's really worried about its potential impact on things like our mental well-being, the effects on children,
Yeah.
even the damage it could be doing to democracy itself, by spreading misinformation and amplifying divisions.
It's one thing to find those ads annoying.
Yeah.
But it's another to think about the bigger picture and how this massive industry is influencing our lives.
Absolutely. And we're talking about a market worth something like $500 billion annually.
Wow.
That kind of financial power gives these tech giants incredible influence over what we see and what we hear.
For sure.
And Johnson believes this needs much closer scrutiny.
Yeah.
He actually suggests something pretty radical: heavy taxes on digital advertising.
Really?
To try and curb its negative impacts.
I can only imagine the debates that would spark if something like that was proposed.
Oh, absolutely.
But it does make you think, is it time to rethink our approach to this massive industry? Should it really operate with so little oversight?
It's definitely a question worth asking.
Especially when you consider the potential consequences.
Right. And this actually leads into another concern Johnson raises, one that I think a lot of people share. He's worried about a handful of companies dominating the AI landscape.
Like who?
Well, companies like Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about too. It's exciting to see what AI can do, but it's also a bit unnerving to imagine so much power in the hands of just a few companies.
Exactly. What happens if they end up controlling the development and the direction of AI?
Right.
Johnson argues that we could end up with AI becoming this unquestioned oracle.
Oracle.
Yeah. The ultimate source of information that everyone relies on without even thinking critically.
It's almost like something out of a dystopian sci-fi novel.
Right.
Where people just blindly follow whatever the algorithm tells them.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just access to information.
I see.
It's about who gets to shape the narrative.
Right.
Who gets to decide what's true and what's not.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. And then Johnson brings up some pretty sobering data on wage stagnation.
Oh, yeah.
For lower middle-income workers in the U.S., and this trend has been going on for decades, since the 1960s.
Wow.
And he connects this directly to things like automation, globalization, and the decline of unions.
So it's like a perfect storm of forces squeezing the middle class. And technology is a key player in all of this.
That's one way to look at it. And it's not just limited to the U.S. either. It's happening in many developed economies around the world.
MIT economist David Otter actually has a term for this.
What's that?
He calls it job market polarization.
Okay, job market polarization. Can you break that down a bit for our listeners? I think a concrete example might help people grasp the concept.
Okay, so imagine a town where the only jobs left are either super well-paying tech jobs or low-paying service sector jobs with pretty much nothing in between. What happens? The middle class shrinks.
Yeah.
And the gap between the haves and the have-nots just gets wider and wider.
Wow.
That's job market polarization in action.
When you put it like that, it really paints a clear picture.
Right.
It makes you wonder if we're headed for a future where a tiny elite thrives.
Yeah.
While everyone else is struggling to get by.
That's the very question Johnson is raising. And he doesn't just outline the problem.
No.
He actually challenges some of the core assumptions behind our entire economic system.
Like what?
He even questions the fundamental purpose of corporations and how they're governed.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Is he suggesting that we need to rethink this whole idea of shareholder value? This idea that companies exist solely to maximize profits for their shareholders.
He is indeed, Johnson argues, that this intense focus on shareholder value, while it seems logical on the surface, can actually backfire in the long run.
How so?
Well, if companies only prioritize profits above everything else, they might start treating their workers as just another cost to be minimized.
I see.
Which ultimately ends up eroding their consumer base.
That makes sense. If you squeeze the middle class too hard, they won't be able to afford your products or services.
Precisely. It's a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
And to really understand this, we need to look back at the historical context.
Okay.
This narrow view of a corporation's purpose was really influenced by Milton Friedman's ideas back in the 1970s.
Milton Friedman, his ideas were definitely influential.
For sure.
But maybe they were a bit too focused on profits and not enough on people.
An interesting thought.
It's definitely something to ponder as we keep going with this deep dive.
I agree. It's a complex issue with far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. It's interesting because this idea of corporations needing to maybe shift their focus, it's not just about fairness,
Right.
It's about sustainability too.
Yeah,
A strong middle class is actually really crucial for a healthy economy in the long term.
absolutely.
But one thing I appreciate about Johnson is he doesn't just critique the system, he offers solutions too.
Yeah.
He even has some specific advice for South Korea.
Oh, really?
A country that's a tech powerhouse, but also facing serious challenges.
Like what?
Well, their low birth rate and aging population.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
And Johnson points out that while automation might help in some areas, it's not a magic bullet,
Right.
He says it won't solve the growing need for caregiving as their population ages.
That makes sense. I mean, you can't just replace human connection and empathy with robots.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Johnson's bigger point about redefining what we mean by prosperity. It's not just about GDP growth. It's about the well-being of individuals and the strength of our communities.
I like that.
So are we heading towards a future where robots are taking care of the elderly while the rest of us are just navigating a world shaped by algorithms? It sounds like a sci-fi movie.
It does a bit. But Johnson believes that understanding these challenges is the first step towards finding solutions.
It's like that saying, forewarned is forearmed.
Exactly.
But understanding is only part of it. What concrete steps can we actually take to build a fairer, more prosperous world in this age of, rapid technological change?
Well, Johnson suggests that we need to move beyond this narrow focus on shareholder value and embrace what's called a stakeholder approach.
A stakeholder approach? What does that mean?
So instead of just asking what's good for the company's bottom line,
Right.
a stakeholder approach considers the interests of all parties involved.
Yeah.
Workers, consumers, communities, even the environment.
So it's like expanding the circle of concern
Exactly.
from what's good for me to what's good for us.
And this requires a shift in mindset, not just from businesses, but from policymakers too.
I see.
We need regulations that promote competition, protect workers' rights, and ensure that the benefits of tech progress are shared more equitably.
So it's not about demonizing technology.
No.
It's about using it responsibly.
Right.
Shaping it in a way that actually serves humanity.
Exactly. Harnessing its power for good.
And this circles back to our discussion about AI potentially becoming that unquestioned source of truth.
Yeah.
We need to be really wary of that.
We do. We need to encourage critical thinking, media literacy, the ability to question the information we're constantly bombarded with.
Not just blindly accepting everything we see online.
Exactly.
It's almost like we all need to develop these internal BS detectors.
I love that analogy. And this is where education is so crucial. We need to equip future generations with the skills and knowledge to navigate this increasingly complex tech landscape.
So teach them how to think critically.
Yes.
How to evaluate information, how to be responsible citizens in this digital world.
Precisely. It's about giving them the tools to be architects of their own futures.
Not just passive consumers of technology.
Right.
Which reminds me of our earlier conversation about digital advertising.
Oh, yeah.
If we accept Johnson's comparison to cigarettes and junk food, should we treat it the same way? Heavy taxes regulations.
That's a really tough question.
It is.
On one hand, freedom of speech is so important.
Yeah.
And we don't want to censor information.
Right.
But on the other hand, we also need to protect people, especially children, from harmful content and manipulation.
It's a tricky balance for sure.
It is a very complex issue with no easy answers.
But it's definitely a conversation we need to have.
Absolutely, as a society.
Do we want to live in a world where our attention is constantly hijacked by algorithms?
Right.
Designed to keep us scrolling and clicking and buying?
It's like we're all trapped in this giant attention economy.
Yeah.
And the stakes are just getting higher and higher as AI becomes more sophisticated.
If we're not careful, we could end up in a world where critical thinking is replaced by algorithmic echo chambers.
Yeah.
Where our choices are manipulated and our privacy is eroded.
That's a pretty bleak future.
It is one we need to avoid at all costs.
Agreed. But what can we do?
Yeah, what practical steps can we take both as individuals and as a society?
Well, on an individual level, we can start by becoming more mindful of our own tech use.
Okay.
Limit our screen time, be more selective about the content we consume, actively seek out diverse perspectives.
It's like taking control of our own digital diets.
Exactly. Be intentional about what we feed our minds.
And we can support organizations and initiatives that are promoting responsible tech development and use.
Absolutely. There are a lot of great people out there fighting for a more equitable and sustainable digital future.
It's about using our voices, our choices, even our wallets to shape the world we want to live in.
I love that. And that brings us back to the role of government. We need policymakers who understand these issues.
Yes.
And who are willing to implement regulations that protect the public interest.
Finding that balance between innovation and regulation,
right,
between freedom and responsibility.
Exactly. And this requires informed and engaged citizens who are willing to hold their elected officials accountable.
We can't just sit back and let technology dictate our future.
We can't. We need to be active participants in shaping it.
So it's a call to action.
It is.
To be more mindful, more informed, and more engaged in this conversation about the future.
I agree. But before we get too carried away with saving the world, let's take a moment to appreciate Johnson's personal journey.
Yeah.
Winning a Nobel Prize, that's an incredible accomplishment.
It really is. It's a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the diversity of thought.
Absolutely.
And speaking of shaping the future, Johnson had some interesting things to say about South Korea.
Oh yeah, let's dive into that.
So we were talking about Johnson's advice for South Korea and, their low birth rate and aging population.
Right. And he makes this point that automation might be helpful in some sectors, but it can't solve every problem.
Like he specifically says that it can't solve their growing need for caregiving.
Exactly. As their population ages, they're going to need more and more caregivers, and robots can't really fill that role.
That makes you think, if AI can't solve this caregiving crisis, what other innovations or social structures might be needed?
That's a great question.
What role should governments play in all this?
These are questions we need to be thinking about, not just in South Korea, but globally.
For sure, technology is a tool.
Yeah.
And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah.
It's up to us to decide how we want to use it.
I agree. So it's not just about the technology itself, but about the values that guide its development and its application.
We need to be prioritizing things like human well-being, fairness, sustainability,
absolutely,
making sure that the benefits of technology are shared broadly.
Yes, not just concentrated in the hands of a few.
This has been such a fascinating conversation.
It really has.
But I want to bring it back to our listeners for a moment.
Okay.
What does all this mean for you? How do you see these trends playing out in your own lives?
I think it's worth taking some time to reflect on the role that technology plays in your life.
Yeah.
How does it affect your work, your relationships, your sense of well-being?
Are there ways you can use technology more mindfully, more intentionally?
These are all things to consider.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Technology is a powerful force, but it's not an unstoppable one. We have the power to shape its trajectory.
Right.
And to make sure that it serves humanity.
Not the other way around.
It's a challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity.
I agree. Let's embrace it with wisdom, courage, and compassion.
And on that note, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Join the conversation on social media and share your insights, your questions, or any ideas you might have.
We're always listening.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.